Good evening, everybody. Welcome to meditation. During one of our most recent chats, I talked about how each and every one of us in our very significant, important lives is nothing more than a sentence, in a paragraph, on a page, in a chapter, in a whole book. But we also know from living our lives that each and every one of us has a story or several stories, and that each and every one of us is, in fact, a story. And the storyteller is one of the primary archetypes of human consciousness. The telling of stories is the way we have handed down our culture, our traditions, our religions. It's the way we have held communities together. It's the way we have healed each other and helped each other. So the storyteller is a thread that runs through all human consciousness, more so than any other sentient beings. But when we look at other mammals predominantly, there is the handing down of behaviors in terms of demonstration and the sharing of frequencies. So dolphins, for example, have stories that they share with each other, except their stories are more factual, nowhere near as fictional or as ego-driven as human stories. The other thing about human stories is that they are great lessons. And when a human story is used as a lesson, we call it a parable, where the story is told for some moral code to be established, and when that story is told over and over and over again across generations, it becomes entrenched in our consciousness to the extent that we believe everything about it. And as a result, the human ego tends to repeat its history. It's so repetitive, in fact, that we are nothing more than cyclical beings at this point in time. Most of the teachers in modern history have used stories for their teaching. And here, whenever we talk to Osho, he always has a story about something. Shirdi Baba very often has a story. Even Shiv himself has stories as a way of demonstrating the subtle nuances of human behavior that drive human behavior, that actually indicate that there are so many layers beneath the behavior, and that while we cannot fathom the layers and the actual pinpoint, the actual focal point of where that behavior begins, its actual source, we are able to see it in a context. And so stories set the context of any particular personality or character or point of development. Now, I love stories. Everything in my household has a story. If you walk around the house and you say, oh, that's beautiful, I will be able to tell you a story about it that usually involves some kind of divine intervention or a really good bargain or some person who has left their energy here for us to cherish and enjoy. And as a speaker and as somebody who enjoys the language of English, I tend to think in stories. More often than not, when we come to meditation and I am talking about some incident from which I am learning and choose to share that learning, there is a story being told. So for today's chat, I want to tell you a story. This is not an invitation to nod off to sleep. It is not a bedtime story. It is, however, a story where I want you to listen to the story and pay attention to where you are resonating with it. If there are behaviors in it that you can identify for yourself, and if you can see all of the threads that come together in terms of how one sentence in an aeons-long story may actually be a whole chapter in somebody else's story and no more than a phrase in another's. the story that each and every one of us is living impacts on a variety or a range of other stories, and we always have a free will, conscious decision to make about how we impact on other people's stories. So let us begin with the story. There once was a man who was a lawyer, and he wasn't a very good lawyer, meaning he wasn't good at using the law or manipulating it to stand up for his clients or to fight for justice, but he was a good man. Although he wasn't very good at his job, he was able to have quite a range of clients because he was kind, because he cared about their needs and their cases, and he cared about the outcome. He would bend over backwards to serve his clients, and they all, regardless of whether they lost their cases or not, felt that they had found in him not just a sympathetic ear, but somebody who was firmly on their side. As a family man, he was well loved and well liked. 3 children and a wife kept him very well occupied during his days off. And in addition to all of that, he had a few God-given talents, such as his resourcefulness when it came to playing musical instruments. He particularly enjoyed music, playing instruments, singing, and so very often his community would gather for an impromptu concert in his little home, where they would laugh and sing and enjoy the presence of each other. And in doing so, he became a pillar of his community, somebody who demonstrated how to be an active participant, to be a mentor to others, to share your skills and talents so that everyone benefited. And if ever there was a problem in his community, people would turn to him for advice. He was well respected. But at the core of his being, he always thought that he was meant for better things. He had a dream, or a vision one might say, of his own house, a house that would show the world that he had accomplished. And in his mind, he saw his house with as many bedrooms as required to accommodate himself with his wife and his children, possibly a few guests, and of course, the highlight of the space would be his music room, a space where he could sing to his heart's content and play his musical instruments and invite other musicians to share the space with him. At long last, he was able, because of his kindnesses to so many people that ensured a growing clientele, to realize the vision of purchasing his own home. And eventually he and his wife came across a beautiful old house, very much like the one we're sitting in, with high ceilings and beautiful stained glass windows in a beautiful, peaceful neighborhood. The people who were selling him the house were very enthusiastic about him joining the neighborhood, and he thought he would fit right in, because here was a neighborhood that watched out for each other. But when he bought the house, he decided that the old house, steeped in history, didn't match who he was, that it didn't show who he was to the people around him. He often said when he looked at the house that nobody would believe, looking at it, that he would own it. It said nothing about him to the world. And so he began to make plans to renovate it. It took years for him to renovate his beautiful old house that was newly purchased. And in the time it took for him to do that, to decide exactly what changes he wanted made, to order the plans, and to actually bring that house down to its shell, he spent a great deal of time talking to his old neighbors about his new house. to the extent that people began to avoid him. They didn't want to hear every detail of this beautiful new house in a smart neighborhood that he was moving into. They didn't want to hear how he was moving up in the world. They didn't want to hear about how much money he was spending on this house. And in the years that it took for this renovation to take place, he paid no attention to the needs of his family. He didn't consult, so whenever his wife wanted a particular alteration or desired the house to be done up in a particular way, he would make the decision about it. His daughter's grand 21st birthday came and went without him purchasing the car he had promised, because he had spent all of the money on the house. Family holidays were put on hold because he was investing in the family home, this house that was going to present him in the world and represent him in the world. And as the years passed and the house was done up, it changed the face of the neighborhood. All around him, neighbors were objecting to his plans. They didn't like that he had destroyed the grand old lady who sat on the corner. They didn't like that he had cut down the trees. They didn't like that he was putting a modern monstrosity on all of their doorsteps. And they objected. What was once a peaceful neighborhood was filled with tension. He, on the other hand, saw no reason for this tension and no reason for these objections. He had worked hard to purchase this house. It was his, to do with as he pleased. And for as long as he was able to pay for his repairs and renovations, surely it was his money and he could spend it at will. He didn't care much for his neighbors either, because they appeared to be doing nothing more than creating one obstacle after the other. But by the time the house was done, he was not on friendly terms with any of the neighbors who had originally welcomed him to the neighborhood. And finally the day arrived when he could move into his newly renovated house. By this time, not only was the entire community from his original dwelling space not speaking to him and avoiding him, but the community he was moving into wished to have nothing to do with him. In addition, his wife, who had been ignored and neglected through the entire process, and saw her dream of her own home, a home that would welcome people, a home in which she would continue to raise her children and her grandchildren, she saw that dream disintegrate. She saw the man she'd been married to for over 25 years become a stranger, and gradually she withdrew into herself, being unheard and unseen as he proceeded with his plans. By the time he moved into his new house, his children were no longer having dinner at the family table, disappointed in all of the promises that had been broken, all of the losses that they were experiencing, and this grand change to the quality of family life. They wandered off on their own pathways, being inclined to spend more time with other people's families than with their own. So by the time he moved into his beautiful new house, he had a sickly wife and absent children. But even then, he gloried in the success. he had painted his house a wondrous shade that stood out in the neighborhood, a color that nobody had ever seen before, and he took great pride in giving his old neighbors and his friends directions to his house, telling them to look out for this specific color. And as the days passed, as he rattled around in his new extra-large house, and the silence of his music room resounded around him, he tried to tell himself that he had accomplished something, that he was proud of himself, that he finally had exactly what he wanted. And each morning, when he prayed, he would sing his mantras in devotion to Lord Shiv, and he would ask for a sign, for something to show him that he had done the right thing, that he was a success. Each morning he would do his mantras and raise his vibrations in order to commune with Shiv. And each morning Shiv would reply, "Look to your heart. See to your heart." And each morning he would hear Shiv say, "Look to your house. See to your house." This went on for years until eventually his wife's doctors recommended that she have a change of climate. She was not healing here. There were no chances of her becoming better in this space, in this environment, and she needed a change of scenery, a change of climate. And this man decided he would take his wife to another space, but to do so, he would have to sell his house. He couldn't afford 2 houses in 2 countries, so he would have to sell his pride and joy. It took a long time for him to come to the decision to sell. And eventually when he did, it was with a heavy heart. But a dutiful husband must take care of his wife, must cater to her needs as ordered by the doctors, and so he put his house up for sale. And of course, he asked for his house that which he had already spent on it, and a little bit more for his effort in redesigning and renovating it to this elevated standard of perfection that everybody for miles around could see so easily. And no one wanted to buy it. It sat there, sitting like a sore thumb, sticking out like a sore thumb, and no one wanted to buy it. Eventually his wife got tired of waiting for him to sell the house, and she had to leave in order to heal, and she left the country without him. And while she was away, he continued to do his job and to live in his house. But he was no longer kind. He was no longer compassionate. He was no longer interested in his clients' stories. He saw them all as a means to paying for his house and maintaining his lifestyle, maintaining his wife's lifestyle in another country. And the longer it took for him to sell the house, the more frustrated he became, the more bitter he became, that this house, the pinnacle of his dreams, was of no value to others. Until one day, while sitting quietly, no song, no music, just sitting quietly, he heard Shiv say, "See to your heart. See to your heart." And this time, he heard the word heart. And he realized all that he had lost in attaining this dream. All around him, his old neighbors, his old friends of many years, even his new neighbors, looked at the monstrosity of a house and laughed behind their hands at the lonely old man rattling around in it. And everybody agreed karma had caught up with him. And still, all Shiv said was, "Look to your heart." The house remains unsold. It remains a monstrosity in the neighborhood. Now it is a legend. As people go by, they point to it and they talk about the old man who met with karma long before he met with his maker. And they speak of how he lost everything, including himself. Now, where we live in society, and we look at other people, and we look at their stories, and we hear their stories, and we share their stories, it is very easy to say karma has caught up with someone. And we speak of karma as if it is a punishment, something that holds us accountable in the universe. We don't ever speak of karma as something we are creating for ourselves as we traverse our pathways and create our stories. We forget that we may reach a moment in time when we choose to do the right thing, and the support that we require in doing it is no longer available. That when we have done the wrong thing so often, no one is available to support the right thing. You will all have heard the story of the boy who cried wolf. It is exactly the same kind of story. But all of the links in this story speak to an ordinary man. He's not obsessed. He's following a dream. He's doing all of the normal ego human things. He has faith enough in God. Enough that God answers his prayers. He is able to offer devotion. And yet, karma catches up with him too. Karma is something we are creating alongside everything else, in every moment of every day. And whenever somebody says, "I want peace, how do I have peace in my life?" then we have to start with the little things. Stop lying. Because every lie you tell is your karma in the making. Every lie you tell dissipates your peace. Every lie you tell is another rug to trip over. Stop agitating about things that are not your business. Practice the 4 agreements. Be impeccable with your word. Work in the direction of love. All of these little mindfulness moments that string together as peace. There is an old Nepal story about a river runs through it. And in the story, the river itself is an active part of the community, gathering the stories, listening to the secrets of the people in the village, and taking those stories further and further down to the sea. And that's what we are. We are a river of consciousness, flowing through the galaxies, carrying our stories into a mass consciousness. And what we bring to the ocean is up to us. We can bring more and more karma, or we can bring more and more peace. Some may argue that karma is in itself a deterrent, that it's a bit like the death penalty, We put it there as a deterrent and nobody wants to implement it until it actually catches up with you and bites you in the backside. But it's not. It is just a cyclical dynamic in the universe, that as you create, so too do you challenge yourself. As you create, so too do you bring yourselves the lessons you most require, because you are not paying attention to what you are creating and how you are creating and where you are creating from. All Shiv says is look to your heart. Is what you are doing, is what you are saying, is who you are being, leaving you peaceful? Are you at ease with yourself? Or are you creating some kind of dis-ease and distress later? I'm also always very interested when people tell me their stories, especially their stories about communicating with spirit, how they hear things. They hear things. And I say, you're hearing things. And they agree with me wholeheartedly, not knowing that I'm actually just being ironical. Because they're not hearing what is said. They're hearing things. As if their phantom minds are telling them exactly what they want to hear, but in the voice of God. We are hearing things. And karma is the price we pay for not getting quiet enough, silent enough within ourselves, to be the peace in the river that runs through it. So in one lifetime, you may be no more than the phrase or an entire sentence in somebody else's story. But if you stop for a moment and you consider all of the stories around one man, the story of his wife becoming more and more ill, the story of his children no longer being united by a family or in harmony with their communities, the fragmentation of an entire system of values by which they lived, then you will find many stories, many human challenges and issues. And just as there are unfulfilled promises on the human plane, there are unfulfilled promises on the sacred plane. So just to reassure you all, there is no such thing as a God who has time to punish anybody or everybody. But in giving us all free will, God has given us a system of self-accountability. And that's exactly what karma is, a system of self-accountability. When karma unfolds with the greatest abundance, we don't say, oh my God, karma's caught up with you. Isn't that wonderful? We only ever speak of it as a punishment. And yet my karma has been catching up with me for a long time now, and I'm thoroughly enjoying every step. So karma is both. It is what you judge to be good, and it is what you judge to be bad. And if you took away the judgment, if you took away the notion that it lives over there somewhere and is going to be imposed on you by others, then moment by moment in this mindfulness, you will see and you will feel the reward or the punishment you are creating for yourself. You will experience your karma in the moment. And you will not be blind to the creation of it or the coming of it. You will look to your heart. Let us meditate.